Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the London Institute of Banking and Finance. On the webinar topic today is regarding gender equality in banking and finance. My name is Nadim Choudhury, and I head up the Careers and Employability Department at the Institute. And I'm also a lecturer on our undergraduate degree programs. I am delighted to be hosting this webinar in conjunction with our colleagues from Nationwide. Can I just ask who's online, please? Quickly type in where you're dialing in from. It would be nice to see where you're joining us from today. Manchester, Jersey, Hertfordshire, anyone from further afield? Okay, Maldives, there you go. There's someone somewhere exotic, but mostly from around the UK, all over the UK. And we've also got someone joining us from Dubai, Italy, Toronto, Canada. Okay, so as you can see, we've got an international crowd today. Welcome to everyone. Before I start with introducing our key speakers, I have a few housekeeping rules. Can all attendees kindly keep their microphones and cameras off? This should be automatic, but sometimes there is a glitch with Zoom, so please do check that these are off. Each speaker will be given about 10 minutes to speak or so. We'll have about 45 minutes of discussion, followed by 15 minutes for Q&A. Please do contribute to the discussion by typing your questions into the chat function. Our events team will collate the questions, and I'll pick some key questions from our speakers to address at the end, after everyone has finished speaking. If we cannot get to your question, please don't worry. We will get our speakers to respond via email and circulate the answers at a later date. So the topic of gender equality in banking and finance has been an important one for many years, but it also plays a key part in the wider discussions around diversity and inclusion within our sector. There's been a lot of progress which has been done till date, but there's still a lot of work to be done in this area. Data from the HMRC shows that women make up 45%, nearly half of the financial services workforce. However, representation of women in leadership roles within major financial firms globally is much lower at around 20%. In this webinar today, we'll be discussing the following topics: why gender equality is important. We'll hear more about the gender pay gap, what it is, and what firms should be doing to address it. We'll be listening to the personal career stories and experiences from our speakers in how they have overcome barriers in achieving leadership positions. And then we'll finish off with some questions and answers. I'm sure you'll all agree that it's through listening to the career stories of our guests that we'll be able to gain some real insights into this important topic. I'm now going to let the speakers introduce themselves when they speak in more detail, but very briefly, if I can just ask Caroline to wave. Hi, Caroline. Caroline is our senior lecturer at LIBF. Then we've got Julie. Julie, if you can wave. Julie works in the People Growth and Performance Department at Nationwide and is a senior consultant. We've got Heather. Hi, Heather. Heather is a regional director at Nationwide. And last but not least, we've got Jagdeep who's at the regional director at HSBC. I'm going to hand over now to Caroline, who'll talk about why this topic is important and take us through some of the research that she's undertaken in this place. And then I'm going to hand over to Julie to further our discussions. So welcome, Caroline.
Thank you, Nadim, and thank you to Nationwide and the London Institute of Banking and Finance for inviting me to talk today. Gender diversity and all forms of diversity are subjects that are very close to my heart. And before moving into HE and lecturing in the London Institute of Banking and Finance's undergraduate degree programmes, I worked for a high street bank for around 15 years. And in my time there, I experienced a number of gender-related challenges, but oddly enough, this wasn't what sparked my interest in gender equality. But even so, I'd like to go back to my career in financial services and also that of my mother, so I can show you some of the evolution of the industry in respect of gender equality and just how far the industry has come in the last 50 or so years. And these experiences will be familiar to those of you who've listened to the podcast I recorded last year, so I'm going to be brief at this point. But going back to my mum's career, my mum worked in a bank in the 60s and 70s. And my mum at that time was better qualified than my dad, who worked in the same bank, but he was sponsored through his professional banking qualifications while she wasn't. Women just weren't seen in that light at that period of time. They weren't seen as future managers and leaders of banks. And my mum's abiding memory of her first banking career was being told that she was dead wood when she got engaged to my dad, because as far as the bank was careered, a married woman just wasn't career material. And when she became pregnant with her first child, which was me, she had to leave. There weren't any maternity leave schemes or returners programs in the bank. And then my mum had a second career in financial services in the 1980s when women could return to work after maternity leave. But even then, my mum, who worked in a bank for over 25 years, never had a female manager. Now, when I joined the bank in the 2000s and around that time, 1990s and 2000, gender equality had improved. Women managers in junior levels were becoming quite common, but they were still seen significantly underrepresented at the more senior levels. And there was still a disconnect between women having a career and being a mother. For example, I worked with a female manager who wanted to work part-time after the birth of her second child so that she could juggle work and childcare, but she was told her options were either to give up her management position and work part-time in a clerical role or continue to work full-time as a manager. There wasn't an option to pursue a career and manage childcare in that way. And then I saw that disconnect firsthand when I became pregnant with my first child. My manager at the time, who was a regional director, just put his head in his hands when I told him I was pregnant. The director of the business unit I worked for just said, "Well, I thought you were a career girl." There was no real sense or acknowledgement that a woman could have a career and a child. And at that point in time, inappropriate comments were also quite commonplace in the workplace in a way they just wouldn't be tolerated today. But as I said, my experiences in financial services aren't what sparked my interest in gender equality. The attitudes I experienced and that my mum experienced before me were just embedded in the culture of financial services at the time. And to a large extent, they just went unchallenged because it was just the way things were. So my interest in gender equality really began when I started to research gender equality as part of a bigger piece that I was investigating on fairness, and then gender equality became my primary focus. So I'd like to throw out a question to you at this point, if I may, but first I'm going to set the scene. So Nadim has already talked about some of the challenges we see with the representation of women at senior levels. So I'm just going to give you some figures from my research. So we know that women have account for about 50% of the population, just over. But research shows that in 2019, women only represented 39% of world employment. And then the further women go up the career ladder, the worse this disparity becomes. So, for example, in OECD countries, only 31.9% of management positions are held by women. And when you look at board level, it's only 22.9% of positions that are held by women. In the US, women are under 80% as likely as a man to be promoted into a management level job. So effectively, there's a glass ceiling. And we know that women aren't underrepresented in the workplace because they're less qualified. Research has proven that actually women are typically more qualified as a group than men, both at or all at undergraduate, master's and doctorate level. Further research also shows it's not that women aren't capable of holding or having the skills or the aptitude for these senior roles. So what we've actually got is an unexplained gender underrepresentation. And we need to think about why that is and whether it's going to resolve itself organically. And when I say organically, I mean through the journey that we and businesses and financial services in general has been on in the last 50 or so years to become more aware of gender inequality, and for us to allow that pace of change to continue in the way it has until we reach parity, or at least until we've got better female representation at those senior levels, or whether we actually need to take more positive action to address the female underrepresentation in the workplace. So if I go back to the question I would like you to add your thoughts in the chat box to is, how long do you think it will take for women to gain equality in the global workplace if we continue with the current pace of change? So I'd say if you could just add your thoughts into the chat box. I'm going to pause for 10, possibly even 20 seconds just to give you some time to add your thoughts. Okay, there are quite a lot coming through. I think typically it seems to be 10, 50, maybe up to 50 years. A few are saying 100. Okay, but from my very quick scanning, I think probably between 30 and 50 years seems to be the sort of average I'm seeing. It's actually 202 years. And I don't know about you, but I find that absolutely shocking. So when I discovered that, the first thing I wanted to do was understand whether it was actually a choice that women were making, whether significant numbers of women were choosing not to progress their careers past a particular point. And to an extent, this is the case. Research does indicate that women do frequently make different life choices to men. So, for example, some research has found that women have got more life goals than men, and quite often they do choose different choices when they reach a particular level of seniority, and sometimes prefer to prioritise non-work life. Other research reveals that women are typically less power orientated than men, and that can also contribute to them choosing to progress to senior levels or not. But equally, we know from other research that it's not just a choice. Sometimes that lack of progression and underrepresentation is something that is built into the system or into a norm within financial services rather than the choice that women are making. And this is often referred to as the glass ceiling, which I mentioned a moment ago. So it's that concept that there's some form of unseen barrier that prevents women from progressing, regardless of what qualifications or achievements or aptitudes they've got. And of course, this sort of lack of progression is cumulative. So if there are less women than men progressing at each stage of the career ladder, then you're getting a smaller and smaller pool of women to choose from at every stage. And also the fact that there are progressively less women at each career stage means that there are less and less women being trained for the next stage, which holds women back further. So the 1995 US Glass Ceiling Commission report, which was called Good for Business, is really useful because what it does is identify 3 forms of barrier that reinforce glass ceilings. Because if we can understand what these barriers are, then we can start to tackle them. So the first of the barriers that the Glass Ceiling Commission report identifies are societal barriers. And they suggest there are 2 of these barriers, and they call them the difference barrier and the supply barrier. And the difference barrier comes from stereotyping, prejudice, and bias. So it's really that concept that people can be either consciously or unconsciously, they can make discriminatory judgments about someone who they see as being different to them or different to what they're used to seeing. So, for example, assuming that a female executive on a board that is dominated by men is somehow less able to do the job than the rest of the board members just because they're used to seeing men in that role and not women. And then the supply barrier the report talks about is concerned with female access to education and life experiences. And then if we move into the second form of barrier that they identify, which are the internal structural barriers, they're things like the recruitment practices, which just don't reach women. They don't target women adequately. Corporate culture in organizations which isolates or alienates women, or lack of mentoring, for example, in the workplace. And then the third of the barriers that the Glass Ceiling Commission identifies are government level barriers. So they're things like lack of enforcement, for example, for breaches under equality legislation. Now, in the UK, we're lucky, aren't we, that we've got really robust equality laws. So for the rest of this talk, I'm not going to focus on that third barrier. I'm going to look at the other barriers and what we can do to try and overcome them. And of course, the very first thing we can do is engage in conversations like this, because it's through sharing ideas, starting discussions, that we start to shine a light on gender inequality. And then in terms of other things that we can do, and starting with the difference barrier, we need to try and work on breaking down those gender stereotypes and those unconscious biases that almost all of us hold. And one way of doing this is to recognise that the more women that progress into senior roles, the more role models that we have. And there's a saying that you can't be what you can't see. Now, I don't actually agree with that. I think you can be what you can't see. And if you look at Kamala Harris, our new female vice president of the United States, she's really current proof that women can be what they can't see. But we just need to have more strong, passionate, intelligent, articulate women that can reach out for the next role and inspire other women to reach out for that next role and make those roles seem accessible to them. Women like that who are successful in their roles also contribute to dismantling stereotypes. And you'll also find that being in a minority is isolating and it can be lonely. And having role models in the workplace helps break down that sense of isolation. And you've also got the workplace mentoring schemes that, again, can help overcome that difference barrier. And the role of male advocacy is very important because we've still got boards that are dominated by men. So the people who are sitting on these boards need to understand the value of gender diversity. And then the next barrier I want to just quickly talk about is the supply barrier. And to break it down, we need to ensure that women have got access to education so that they can build their knowledge and their skills, and to the life experiences that show them that they can achieve, they are capable of progression and getting those senior roles. And unfortunately, that supply barrier is still a challenge that we're seeing in financial services, and still too few women are entering the industry. We're not seeing parity between men and women entering financial services. And outreach programs help. So for example, at the London Institute of Banking and Finance, we give talks to schools. We've got a Women in Finance undergraduate student group, and other organisations have got similar schemes. STEM projects in school are valuable because they help wider participation in science and technology, engineering, maths, for women who are interested in pursuing those pursuing those different disciplines. And then the final barrier I just want to talk about briefly are those internal structural barriers that still exist in the workplace. And to ensure that recruitment opportunities reach women, that businesses look at the culture within the organisation and address any practices that limit women and limit their opportunities to progress. And businesses are making really good strides in facilitating flexible working. So for instance, we've seen really good parental leave schemes come in, but there's still more that businesses can do. And we need to ensure that businesses understand the scale of the problem so that they can confront it and put in place better steps to ensure we get better female representation at those senior levels. And one of the key measurement tools that we can use to do that is the gender pay gap. So I'm going to pause at this point because I think that neatly segues into the conversations that Heather and Julie are going to have. So I'm going to pause and pass back to Nadim.
Okay, Caroline, thank you so much. I'd like to think that I know quite a lot about this topic from my research, but that 200-year mark, I mean, it kind of blew me away. Like that's crazy that it's going to take that long. It's also interesting to see, that there's a lot of differences going across all over the world. In the United States, like you mentioned right now, there's also bipartisan efforts to get more women in for paid maternity leave, for example. It's not a done deal out there. So I think there's a lot of work to do in this area. I'm going to now hand over to Julie. Julie, thank you so much for patiently waiting. Julie, if you can kindly talk us through the gender pay gap and what it means to Nationwide and some of the discourses around this, please.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And thanks, Caroline. So I'm Julie McCarthy, like we said, from Nationwide Building Society, and I spent many years working in our branch network and then moved over to a HR role, and I'm now an inclusion and diversity manager. And I was really fascinated to hear Caroline's story about her mum, because I can probably continue that story because I started working in 1982. And even though you talk about your mum in the 60s and 70s, still we hadn't got there in the 80s. I can definitely say that. So, for example, when I first started, after a few years, I was tasked with supporting our graduates who were always men. And a year or two later, went on to run all of our branches. And then when I asked the question, well, I'm training them, I could do that job. Can I have one of those jobs? It was like, well, not really. You're a woman. You're probably going to get married soon and leave and have babies. So leave it to the men, essentially. Now, I think that was very much my particular manager's view at the time and not necessarily Nationwide's view. But certainly in my career, I've seen things move massively. Caroline's mum just really resonated with me that, yes, eventually I did get that branch manager's role. And actually that conversation previously had made me more determined to get a branch manager's role, if anything. So I have my sexist ex-boss to thank for that. So Caroline talked about the statistics, and that 202 years, actually I had never heard before, and is really, really shocking. More shocking because there are so many reasons why we need equality in the workplace. You know, diverse companies, we know, are more productive, more profitable. A recent McKinsey report saw that actually the most diverse organisations, their employees are 56% increase in performance from their employees, and actually 19% more profitable. So, you know, an equal society has got to be better for everybody, but still we are lacking diversity, as Caroline said, and we know that. So, you know, another shocking stat is only 4% of CEOs in the UK are female, and you're more likely to be called Steve as a CEO than be a woman, which again is, you know, is really shocking. And so how do we fare in financial services? Well, actually, probably worse. Financial services is still seen as a very male-dominated industry. And as Caroline said, that's because, you know, although we nearly have 50% females represented in financial services, it's mainly in the lower level roles, and we lack senior women. And I really want to go on to pay gaps now, because pay gaps also bear this out. So the average pay gap in the UK between men and women is 14%. However, in financial services, it's 32%. So that's, you know, that's a massive difference. So it's quite shocking to think that males in financial services on average earn 32% more than women. And I really want to stress at this stage that a pay gap is not the same as equal pay. So I'm not saying that, you know, I'm sat next to a guy who's doing exactly the same job as me and he's earning 32% more. Pay gaps, very, very simplistically, the median pay gap is if you added up all of the salaries of your females in your organisation, and divided by the number of females, and then added up all the male salary divided by the number of males. The difference between that is your median pay gap, and that's very simplistic. As we know, legislation came in a few years ago, so any organisation with more than 250 employees have to report their pay gap. And the pay gap has had a result of focusing everybody's minds. So it can be said that it's a blunt instrument. It doesn't necessarily tell the whole story, but actually it's got boards thinking about, gosh, what are we going to do about this? Because nobody really likes reporting that they've got a pay gap. And also there's you know, more emphasis on saying, you know, what are you doing about your pay gaps, etc. And going back to why we need equality, you know, in terms of our customer base, our member base, people are expecting to see more diverse organisations. In fact, at our last AGM, we got more questions about diversity than we did anything else. And also the regulators are really looking at this. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons at the moment why organisations are really starting to take this seriously, which is, you know, it is absolutely a good thing. So pay gaps won't necessarily change behaviour, but they make organisations more transparent and actually start to drive action. So why have we got pay gaps? Now, it's very much related to what Caroline was saying previously. We see, in fact, in the financial service sector. So in pay gaps, we also have to report in quartiles. So we can see that actually the top quartile is very dominated by men. So this is where you've got your highest salaries. And in financial services, only 25% of the top quartile are female. Then underneath that, we do see more women in the next quartile, but they appear to get stuck there. So as Caroline talked about the glass ceiling, and this very much is where the glass ceiling starts rearing its head, actually. So we can see that women are progressing, and they are progressing in financial services, but they're getting stuck at that sort of mid-range. So I want to talk about what influences pay gaps. And again, I talk about a pay gap being a blunt instrument, not necessarily telling the whole story. And it, if I can take Nationwide as an example, quite often in financial services, especially if you've got a big retail arm like us and many of our competitors, we have many women on our branch network on perhaps a lower salaries, and then in your head office roles, more senior roles, you're getting more men in those roles. And why is that? And some of this is societal, as Caroline said, and it's about perhaps what jobs appeal to men and women, and unless society starts thinking about this, we're never going to get parity, and we're probably never going to close our pay gap. That said, there are a lot of things that organisations can do. But, those social norms are still very much with us. We talked about the 60s, 70s and 80s, but there is still a lot of, that's a male job, that's a female job. I know that in the tech space, there are very few women going into that type of industry. And I know within our own division, our own technical division, that's the case. We really struggle to attract females, and every organisation is trying to attract females in that space. So, and they are, that's a good career, very well paid roles. So again, it's those jobs that appeal to to men and female. And then women are more likely to take time out, as Caroline said, to have babies, and may come back part-time, which again can impact their career. Again, with the pay gap, we see that actually the pay gap widens with age as well. So the older a woman is, the bigger the pay gap there is, and that again is reflected in financial services too. And that's because many women have taken time out, to support their children and then come back to their career later. So again, Caroline mentioned education, and 33% of females in the workplace are graduates against 28% of men. So as Caroline said, actually, women can be said to be better educated, but they're still not getting those senior roles. So, there is a lot to think about in terms of, why women aren't getting there. And unless, especially with the societal issues, unless it's seen that, men can work flexibly, etc. too, and it becomes a norm for both sexes, we're never going to get there. And we've talked about the barriers, and I also want to mention the Women in Finance Charter as well. So we've talked about pay gaps being worse in financial services and women just not getting those top places. So 4 years ago, Women in Finance Charter was introduced. And that was really because we realised, that women just aren't getting those senior roles. There was a lack of women on boards. There was a lack of women on excos in many financial service organisations. So Women in Finance Charter now has got over 350 signatories, and it's backed by HM Treasury. And every financial organisation is encouraged to join. And if you do join and sign up to the charter, you're signing up to a number of things. And one of those things is to have targets in place for female representation at a senior level. Nationwide have signed up to the charter. In fact, we were one of the first signatories. And I would urge you all actually check, because you can check on the website, see if your organisation signed up to it, and if they haven't, encourage them to, because it is really a way of progressing organisations. So we've talked about the barriers, we've talked about lack of representation in senior roles, and we could all just sit here being very depressed and think, oh gosh, this is all terrible. But there are lots of things we can do about it, and lots of things that organisations can do, such as embedding inclusion and diversity in everything you do. So if we take recruitment, for example, you know, making sure that your adverts appeal to everybody. And there's actually something called a gender decoder. So you can check your adverts out and make sure that it's, you know, not using male dominated language, that you're only actually asking for the skills that you really need, because women typically look at a job advert and think, oh gosh, it's asking 10 things there. Oh, I can only do 8 of those. Oh, I better not apply for it. And I am generalizing massively, but men would probably look at it and go, well, I can do 5 of those things, but I'll apply for it anyway. You never know. So, you know, we really need to make sure that all of our practices, particularly our HR practices, are inclusive. You know, flexibility and agile working, I talked about making sure that that's not just women working flexibly, it's looking at men as well. More important than ever with COVID, because we've seen through the COVID crisis that actually more women are leaving work because, you know, because of the impact of trying to homeschool, look after the elderly parents, work full time, etc. And again, more of the caring responsibilities is coming down to women. So we really need to think about that. And things like mentoring and sponsorship. You know, Heather's going to speak to you now about her career, and it's really important that you find yourself a mentor, and you absolutely find yourself a sponsor, somebody that advocates for you. And lastly, data. We talked about pay gap, which is one set of data, but make sure that you measure it and you can see through everything throughout. So, for example, in your promotions, you know, is that equal? What percentage of people are getting promoted? You know, how many people are you bringing into your organisation? That you look at your data throughout. So I'm going to pass you over to Heather. So thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. Heather, before we go on to you, I just quickly wanted to reflect. Absolutely echo, Julie, what you're saying. As a career coach, I struggle sometimes to motivate my female students to apply for graduate roles, even now, because they feel as if they don't meet the criteria, whereas some of my male students will just apply anyway. So I see this on a daily basis. And it's also nice to see that, you know, there are positive things that organisations can do to address this as well. Thank you so much. We're now going to move on to the stage of listening to some of the career stories of our speakers. And Heather, if you can kindly lead the way, and then we'll segue into Jagdeep.
Yeah, no problem. So afternoon, everybody. So my name's Heather. I'm a regional director in Nationwide Building Society. And it's interesting actually listening to Caroline and to Julie sort of talk about 60s, 70s, 80s. I started in financial services in the 90s, and it was exactly the same then. So I don't think it kind of changed over the years. But yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about a brief kind of career history for me. Some of the barriers that I've personally faced being a female in I guess banking and finance, and then I think probably more importantly some of the tips that I think we can really help ourselves with around, you know, and I've just been looking at some of the chat, you know, people starting to understand where do you go for mentoring, etc. So hopefully I can give some kind of tips on that. So from a kind of a short career history, it's interesting listening to the conversation about education and graduates and so on and so forth. So I left school at 16 with what I would class as average GCSEs. Wasn't particularly academic, which, you know, drove my parents insane, but not particularly academic, and really wanted to get into the working world, and was lucky enough to do work experience actually in a bank, and then ended up getting a full-time job there. And after about a year, I was really starting to think about actually I could make a career from this, but I didn't really know which way to go. And to the point that Caroline made actually, so this was the sort of early to mid 90s, and I didn't feel that I had a particular role model to look up to, because there was the real lack of females at what I at that time classed as being in, you know, a level that I perceived I wanted to get to. So not purposely, but I actually sought out trying to get male role models that I could look at, but so that I could really start to understand what are the differences between, you know, why aren't there women in senior management positions and so on and so forth. So at the time, I was told on more than one occasion, you're too ambitious. So, and this was nothing to do with education. This was to do, you know, at the time, because I was what was perceived to be a young female in a male-dominated environment. So you're too ambitious, it won't work, etc. And that really instilled something into me, which was determination. And it's something to this very day. So I've been in banking and finance for nearly 30 years. I'll give my age away there, but there's this kind of determination and drive that sits there for me to want to be able to continue to progress and to still have that ambition that I did all those years ago. So the kind of the route that I took was to really to try and take every opportunity that I could take and diversify my CV. So often what you get in banking and finance, I think, is that you tend to get where you start your career path, let's say in retail as an example, and you think that that is the only route that you've got within retail, and actually it isn't. And I think, you know, my first kind of bit of advice that I gave myself and would give to anybody now is that really start to think about opportunities and diversify your CV, because the number of different people that puts you into contact with helps you to get a better and a broader understanding of why aren't females in certain roles, and what is it I can do to help to kind of change that and lessen that gap. And part of that career path for me took me down a corporate and commercial route. So some of you will be in the corporate and commercial world at the minute. And it's a little bit like, Julie, what you were saying around there's a lack of females in tech. So obviously our industry evolves and will continue to evolve. And I do think that the kind of environment that we find ourselves in now is that people will move away from what was traditional face-to-face banking and finance, and will go more digital and so on and so forth because of the environment we find ourselves in. But at the time, I found commercial and corporate banking the one area of our industry for me that enabled me to really understand the differences between male and female. So at the time, I was the only female around the table. I spent 10 years of my career in commercial and corporate banking, and really felt like I was a woman in a man's world. But I kind of didn't like that feeling in myself, and it did make me more determined to start to understand why. And the thing that I found really difficult in that line of business, and we have to do it now, but we have to do it in a different way. So a lot of it will be virtual now. But when we talk about, senior leadership, or we talk about leadership or senior positions, there's often this a stakeholder mapping that you have to do to enable you to have a mentor, to enable you to have a coach, but actually for you to really connect with people in business from not only across the organisation that you work within, but external to that as well. And I found that really, really difficult. So when we talk about networking and building relationships and really starting to make those professional connections, as a female, I found and do still find that quite difficult. And that for me is for three reasons. And the first one is, as I've just said, you're a woman in a man's world. So often, and again, this is, I find this less so now, but in my early career, I found this was really difficult, is often professional relationships were built over a pint at a bar or over a game of golf or whatever it needed to be. And it was really hard as a woman to be able to break into that circle. And unfortunately, what happened to me on a number of occasions, and also to a number of my female colleagues as well, is there is a danger that as a female you can get, and I'll use the word objectified, which is probably too strong a word, but what I mean by that is if you ask somebody to go for a drink because you want to build and maintain a professional relationship, as an example, it's, in my opinion, was much easier to do as a male than it was to do as a female, because you can, it can get taken one of two ways. So I had to find a way to overcome all of that, and I'll come back to that as kind of a how to overcome piece afterwards. So I spent a huge amount of time in corporate and commercial banking, and that really helped me to understand the differences between, I suppose, this male and female piece. And then from then moved up to go over into retail banking. And again, to Julie's point, there are generally more females in retail banking. And I do think that historically that is because there was deemed to be more flexibility in retail banking, so that you could potentially work part-time if you had a family. And that kind of, again, helped me to understand the things a little bit differently, but I still found that there was this lack of role models at a senior level for me to be able to look up to and understand the differences that were there. I'm still in retail banking, but our kind of distribution strategy is moving significantly. And I do think that we are making huge strides in giving females the chance and the opportunity to be able to move up the career ladder. That said, there is still these barriers that we do have to overcome. So I think for me, the education piece for me didn't personally impact me in the sense of not being able to go for roles because I wasn't a graduate or whatever, but actually being only having GCSEs and being told from a very early age that you're too ambitious and you won't be able to achieve what you want to achieve, gave me this drive and determination. So actually I would prove everybody wrong almost. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I do think that should enable people to take the opportunities that are there for them and to really do something different. I actually think around when we talk about how do we overcome this, and I look back on my career and how I have overcome some of the barriers that we face as females, I think it's very easy to sit here and say you have to be confident in who you are, but actually you do. And one of the things that experience has taught me, and probably it only really resonated with me in the last sort of 10 years of my career, is that just be true to who you are. Because often what I found in the early days of my career, I was trying to fit this mold of being potentially the only woman in a man's world, but more importantly, trying to fit into this man's world. And that wasn't my position to do that. Actually, you need to be you and be confident in who you are. And I think the more people that we can get into this, this environment, and the more that you do have this diversity at senior levels, you do get a broader way of thinking. You do really challenge each other's way of thinking as well. But the only way that I've got to be able to do that is to be true to who I am and to not try and be somebody else. And that's, again, something that I still often sort of check myself on and sort of make sure that that still is there. So I think that is the first bit. Determination, as I've said, and I've used that word a few times, has really helped me. And I guess it's this desire to want to continue to be ambitious. But for me, by diversifying my CV and working in a number of different arms of financial services has really helped me to open up those opportunities that have been available. And often, and particularly if you're looking at this from a career perspective, often there is a reluctance to take what is classed as a sideways move as opposed to it being a promotion. And I do think, again, particularly for women, we almost want to prove to ourselves that we can be promoted. So often you don't take that sideways move, but the skills that will give you will only enable you to move forward. So I always take, sometimes you have to take one step sideways to take 10 steps forward. So I think that is a big thing for me. And then I think lastly, there is a huge opportunity at the minute, particularly as the industry we're in is changing and we're having to change. You can create your own opportunities in life and particularly professionally. So all too often, and it's not a regret of mine, but if I look back over the career, all too often I waited for somebody to come to me with an opportunity or to come to me to say, actually, Heather, this might be something that you would really kind of get a lot of value from. But actually, there is a huge opportunity for us now to create our own path. And if you take the networking example as what I was talking about earlier, and building professional relationships, one of the best things that I've done in my career, and this is working with a number of females from across, it was in Manchester actually, but a number of females, we created our own networking group, and that wasn't just for women, it was for anybody, but it was led by women. And what that helped us to do is we shaped how we did that networking, and what that entailed, and it wasn't particularly things that only women would be interested in, but we used a lot of that time to really start to instill confidence about how do you break that first barrier about going into a room with a number of people that you don't know and you have to open up the conversation. So by creating that network, even now, it has helped so many people to start to really think about professionally how they do build those relationships. So create your own opportunities. And as Julie said, there's a number of things that your own organisations will do, but also there are a number of forums that you can attend, such as this one. And I got involved in a local charity in Manchester as well, which was there to help females go through interviews. And it was a charity at the time where you donated your work clothes for people who unfortunately couldn't afford to get a suit to go for a job interview or whatever it was. But that in itself really helped me to understand, and that was just for females, but again helped me to understand what is that little bit of confidence that people need to enable them to go into that situation that they ordinarily would be uncomfortable with. So the kind of last piece for me is to really look at your professional network, but also in your local communities, because there will be a number of ways in which you can get a mentor, you can get a coach, but more importantly, how you can mentor and coach people yourselves. Because if you flip this on its head, yes, it's and I've had a number of mentors over the years, but actually I've probably gained more from mentoring others, because you really get to understand how people are feeling and some of the barriers that they have. So I think for me, just to kind of wrap it all up, so diversify a career, take every opportunity that you can get, I have a personal drive and determination, but that just might be my personality, and someone telling me on more than one occasion that I was too ambitious and I couldn't do it, but that might just be me. And lastly, create your own opportunities, but be true to you. So, you know, men and women are different, and that is a fact, but actually that shouldn't stop anybody. And, you know, there'll be men on this call who will think differently than I will think, but be true to you and don't try and, you know, fit into something that you think you have to do to enable you to move forward. So hopefully, Nadim, that's given a little bit of an insight into my career, some of the barriers that I've faced, but I do think this piece about we can overcome them ourselves and create opportunities ourselves is really important.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I wrote this 3 things down on my notes: determination, drive, and being true to yourself. You know, those are the key takeaways that I've got from your speech. I'm now going to hand over to Jagdeep, who will kindly sort of lead on from that. Jagdeep, if you can kindly tell people a bit about your background and experience, and then I'm sure a lot of things Heather talked about resonates with yourself as well.
Absolutely, Nadim. No, thanks so much, and good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here. So I'm Jagdeep Rai, or Jag, as many people call me, Regional Director for the South at HSBC within their Commercial Banking division. Now, I've spent my whole career in banking, similar to the speakers that have come before me. I graduated with law in a law degree about 25 years ago. Started my career on the graduate management training program at Barclays. Actually, stayed there for 24 years. Did a number of roles across all parts of the business: retail, corporate, marketing, training and development, both frontline and strategic head office type roles. But the place where I found, I guess my true home is in the front line with corporate and business customers and in leading people. So I feel incredibly lucky to be doing a job that I love, that gives me huge personal fulfillment. I always say that I've got the best job in the world, as it allows me to spend time doing the 2 things that I am most passionate about, which is leading people and spending time with customers and businesses. In terms of my current role, so I lead a region across the south of the country in HSBC Business Banking. The patch is very large, diverse across demographic and geography and industry sector, which makes it even more exciting. So, the importance of gender equality. Now, this is something that I'm incredibly passionate about, and certainly for the last 10 to 15 years of my career, I've spent a lot of time off the side of the desk driving forward some positive change when it comes to gender diversity in particular, and more recently, actually, ethnic minority and cultural diversity also. And you might ask yourself, why do you spend your time doing that alongside your day job? Well, you know, for me, it's because I relate to both aspects so strongly and feel almost like a bit of a bigger calling to support some legacy positive change for our industry, given that it has given me so much over the last 25 years. And where does this come from? Well, probably my upbringing and moral compass. It's very simple for me. I believe deeply in fairness and equality across all aspects of D&I, and that's ultimately what it's all about. It's about equal chances, leveling the playing field for all of, for everybody to be at their best, regardless of gender, ethnicity, sexuality, age, disability, all of the things that are outside of individuals' control. And I know that Julie spoke about it at the top of the call. From a business and commercial perspective, it has proved so many times that diverse teams produce better outcomes. You say more profitability, business success, and ultimately having diverse teams that have got a good representations of gender, as we're talking about today, ultimately reflect the community and the society that we serve. And so what that means is we form better connections, deeper relationships, and ultimately make better decisions. Now, sort of looking back in preparing for today, I guess that the first thing I want to say, taking a bit of a retrospective look on the last 25 years, one thing that it has done is made me really acknowledge how lucky I've been as a woman in banking, and how incredibly privileged I guess that we all are to have the opportunities that we have, which, you know, if certainly when I look at my ancestors, they just didn't have, and equally many girls and women across the globe still don't have and are fighting for. And I mean not just opportunity to make career choices that we want, but just in terms of basic civil rights that many women still don't have. And I genuinely believe that we should all recognise that this is a great time to be a woman in business and in our society, because I think and it's been mentioned already, society and business are more than ever acknowledging the commercial and societal value of female diversity and all types of diversity in organisations. And in particular, the value that women can bring to the table in terms of the unique talent and inherent skills and contribution to the success of business and society generally. So my perspective on all of this is that with that comes huge power. And with that power comes choice. So out of everything that I go on to say, that's one thing I would urge all of us never to forget. We are individually and collectively in a position of real strength and must take huge personal confidence from that. So it's with that backdrop, if I look back on my own career and how banking has changed over the last quarter of a century, it makes me feel very old to say that, but it is true, it is a quarter of a century. The industry has changed a lot in that time. However, my view on it is that the challenge is very nuanced. So as I see it, I think the challenge around gender diversity in banking and financial services more broadly isn't necessarily about the number of women we have in the industry, it's about where they sit in the organisation. So what levels of seniority and influence they have, and influence being the key thing for me. Now, if I look back when I started my career all those years ago, I walked into a branch in Slough in Berkshire and met my colleagues for the first time. And one could have said at that time when I walked into that branch that there isn't a gender or ethnicity problem in banking, because there were certainly more than 50% women and certainly a good proportion of ethnic minorities in that branch. But the challenge, as I said, is very much more nuanced than that. So very few, if any of those colleagues were in senior positions or real positions of influence and decision making. So, and I think that's the absolute key here in terms of how we drive this particular dial forward. And now I talk about this a lot. For those of you that have heard me speak previously may well have heard me say this before, but I remember when I first got my first middle management role, I was a relationship director in corporate banking. Now from my name, Jagdeep can be a male or a female name. And actually it was really interesting because people often were expecting a man. When I turned up to one of, like a client meeting, for example, they'd seen an email from me to set up a meeting and they were expecting a man. And often what I would get is, gosh, you really don't look like a banker. And now goodness knows what a banker is supposed to look like. And I don't know whether there is a real stereotype, but certainly it didn't look like me. And that's when it kind of really dawned on me, is that I have to now work twice as hard to gain trust, credibility, and your acceptance, because you've already formed a judgment on me because I'm not the norm. Now, thankfully, now I think it's much more normal to see women in more senior positions in banking than it was 25 years ago, because of all of the work that has happened in the last 15 to 20 years, which is fantastic to see. However, there is still a lot more work to do, as we've been talking about today, to keep moving that dial and to attract, retain, and develop more talented females into banking. And then once they're here, help them progress quickly into more senior roles if they want it. So what have I seen that's happening in the industry right now? And there are a lot of these things have already been mentioned throughout the course of this afternoon. What I'm seeing, and certainly the things that I'm seeing are really making a difference, is we are seeing much more diverse panels. So selection panels, recruitment panels, historically would not be particularly representative of the organisation that we're trying to create. So now, certainly in the organisations that I've worked, we are ensuring that we have female representation on recruitment panels, on promotion panels, so that we are ensuring that we are getting all of the different elements of diversity in terms of that thinking. Actively ensuring that we've got diverse slate of candidates. So for example, if a job comes up or if a role comes up for promotion, ensuring when we're going to recruiters that we are actively looking to ensure that we have, particularly from a gender perspective, that we've got a diverse slate of candidates that we put onto a shortlist. So really making that very deliberate decision to ensure that we are really going out there to ensure that we are getting that representation. The other thing that clearly has also been mentioned, and many of you will have probably been part of this over the years that have worked in financial services and banking, but unconscious bias training has made a massive difference, which has allowed managers, recruiters to really think about some of the subconscious decisions that they make that are in their psyche, so that they don't always recruit, I guess, in their own image. but always think about, you know, the broader things that maybe are influencing their kind of decision making. Somebody also mentioned it. I think men are a massive part of this. So having male allies. I'm pretty sure Heather mentioned it earlier that, you know, understanding, you know, how men act and how men can support the female agenda and drive females forward in the industry, I think is absolutely crucial. And also we've mentioned sponsors and mentors. I equally think that that's, you know, absolutely fundamental. So ensuring that, you know, these are, you know, areas that we really continue to focus on. So my advice, and I'm sorry, I'm conscious I'm probably talking quite quickly, but there's so much I want to say just to kind of in terms of the advice that I want to give. But
go ahead, Jag. We're happy to carry on for another 10 minutes. So
okay, great stuff. Thanks, Nadim. So my advice. So this is really personal advice based on kind of my journey throughout the you know, the banking sector. The first thing that I would say is that don't think of your gender or any kind of element of diversity or any difference that you have from the norm, from the normal stereotypical banker and what they're supposed to look like. Don't think of that as the thing that's going to hold you back. It's very much, for me, the really successful individuals that I see in the organisation that I've worked in are those that can really kind of change their perspective on that, to look at it as that's your edge that makes you different, as opposed to, and that makes you unique, that you can lean into, as opposed to the thing that will hold you back. So absolutely, I think a real key thing is you need to be a rock star at your job. So be brilliant at your job, but then use your uniqueness and your difference in a way that actually will differentiate you, and that will make you stand above the crowd. So that would be my first point. The second point that I would say is that I think we trade in any environment, in any industry, in big corporates. I would say we trade in two currencies. And the two currencies are performance currency and relationship currency. Now, if any of you have heard of a lady called Carla Harris, she very recently did a TED talk. If you get a chance, Carla Harris, look her up. She did a fantastic talk very recently about the importance of sponsors, and talked about how a sponsor is probably the most critical relationship in your career. And she talks about how to get a sponsor. And she talks about these two currencies. So the performance currency, which is very much about, you know, doing what is asked of you in your role, and that little bit more. That little bit more raises your performance currency, and that strong performance currency raises your level of visibility, such that a sponsor may be attracted to you. So that's a key thing. And then the second thing is around relationship currency. Now, what's this about? This is ultimately generated by the investment you make in the people in your environment. And it's like anything in your social life, in your work life, your family life, your friends. The more you put into your relationships around you, the more you'll get out of it. So if you invest your time to connect, engage, get to know the people in your environment, and give them the opportunity to know you, that will make a massive, massive difference in terms of you building those two currencies. So that would be my second piece of advice. It's been mentioned before. Thirdly, I would say be really, really curious to seek out new opportunities. Be hungry for growth and development. I think actually COVID is a real facilitator here. I think COVID has really changed the working dynamic, particularly for women, and the whole flexible working agenda, I think, has moved into a whole new arena now, where flexible working is absolutely becoming the norm and much, much more accepted, because actually this is how we're all working now. We're all having to juggle all of the different priorities, whether it be the kids homeschooling, whether it be all of the things that are going on. It has now become a real enabler, I believe, for female development and females into more senior positions, because roles that potentially would not have been available to women previously because of other commitments, now I think really open up, really open up. So I really think that's a massive enabler. And then I also wanted to talk about confidence. So it's a word, I call it the C word, because we talk about confidence a lot when we talk about female diversity and kind of why we don't see females moving into more senior positions. And I'm not a massive fan of the word because I think it's very broad, and it's kind of it's a word that I'm not sure when we break it down, everybody really understand what it means, because I think it means very different things for different people. So I would really encourage people to break down. If you feel that you don't have enough confidence, work with somebody to work out, what does that mean? what is it that's holding you back? Break it down and then really work on it, because otherwise confidence can be this kind of really, it's a bit like kind of jelly that you can't, it's very, very difficult to get some tangibility on. So really, really working on what are the things that are holding you back. And then failure, the other thing that I did want to talk about, and I think this is a really important one. This is a big learn for me. The time when my career started to really accelerate was when I changed my perspective on failure. Failure is good. Don't be scared of it. Obstacles are good because they force you to look at things from a different angle. It teaches us lessons that are really valuable. We all get curveballs, stumbling blocks, which often force us to examine ourselves and realize kind of, what's our true direction, what's our true north. And it's so important to do that and learn the lessons. So throughout the course of my career, many things haven't gone to plan. I was nearly made redundant. I didn't get the job, didn't get jobs that I wanted, that I thought were my dream jobs. I didn't have good relationships with certain bosses. All of these situations have forced me to reevaluate and make positive change. And I'm just a real believer that every storm in life is a gift. And then authenticity. And this is something, again, that has been mentioned. It's a real theme. Being the real you, connecting back to you. It builds trust, it builds credibility, ultimately your own success and happiness. And I think you're really staying true to those core values, not deviating from them, following your moral GPS and your comfort, your moral compass. But I think that's, we always have to learn from others. But at certain points, certainly in my career, I've learned you've just got to do you. And that's when your real power comes, when you get comfortable in your own skin. And I think that's a really, really important point. Networking, that's the other point that I would have said, building your network is crucial. And I think there's different ways to build networks. We don't necessarily have to be in the room with people in order to do that. There are different ways to do that. And I think, again, COVID has allowed us different opportunities to connect and engage with people, which I think is really positive. And then I think the final point that I would make is, or final 2 points actually, is I think it's really important in order to gain power, that you give power. And what do I mean by that? I mean, I'm a firm believer that life is a reciprocal exchange, and to move forward, you have to give back. So to be successful, you have to keep giving back, and helping others is the way that we help ourselves, which is partly why I do this kind of stuff, because actually it helps me, and it's my way of paying stuff forward for the people that have helped me throughout my career as well. And then the final thing is, I think somebody has also said it, be that change that you want to see. Don't accept things if you're not happy with them. I always think about your career, certainly my career, it's not a race, it's not a level playing field, it's a bit like a jungle gym. Sometimes you've got to go, underneath the barriers around, you've got to find your way around, think of it as a jungle gym that you are finding a way through. And if you can have that mindset, often it makes a massive, massive difference. And then I want to end on the final phrase, which I absolutely love. We've got an African-American Vice President of the US, which I think is fantastic progress for society generally. The fact that Kamala Harris says that she eats no for breakfast, I think should be inspiring to all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jagdeep, for your insights. And one thing that I've really reflected on from listening to everyone is the power of the network and how important it is to network, and also the challenges that many females find with the networking process. With that in mind, I'd just like to let all of our attendees know that the London Institute of Banking and Finance does have an online mentoring platform. So if anyone is interested in networking, do get in contact with us and we can set you up with a mentor. I'm very conscious we've run over, but I do want to go over, say, 1 or 2 questions that we've had. So someone said, networking, how do you do this when balancing all the non-work responsibilities? This really goes back to the question of the double burden syndrome that women have with raising a family, all the home work that needs to be done, but also going to work. Obviously, men are much more involved in that process now, but it's still an issue. Would anyone like to address that question, please?
Nadim, I don't mind kind of jumping in there.
Yeah.
I think the sort of thing with me on networking, and it has been spoken about, is find your way with it, but don't be a busy fool. So one of the things that I learned the very kind of harsh lesson on is when I first started networking, and networking comes in all sorts of guises. So this is networking, we're all meeting different people and we're all listening to different people, but I think there's a tendency to try and attend every event that's going, as an example, and you feel like you've got to do it before or after work, or you've got to try and fit it all into everyday life, and that's not necessarily the case. So I think for me, my own personal advice is don't be a busy fool, but try and find something that really resonates with you and makes you comfortable. So there are a number of different ways in which you can network, and I think broadly that can be any form of talking to somebody that you don't know. So networking can be one-on-one, not necessarily walking into a room and virtually as it would be now with 100 people. But I think the biggest piece for me is don't be a busy fool and really consider what it is that you want to get out of it. So if that is something around talking to somebody that might inspire you or give you a little bit more confidence, then really look at how you get into that. And there are a number of different things that you can do on high street. So, again, we can come out with something, I think, between us all to let people know how they start to do that. But I think, don't try and think you've got to be everything to everybody, because you don't. I think it's just finding the one thing that you're comfortable with and that resonates with you would be my advice.
That's some great advice. I'm going to take one more question and then we'll wrap up. And with everyone else that have asked questions, we will answer your questions individually via email. I'm sure our speakers won't mind responding virtually. Adrian asked, accepting that there might be a natural opt-out by some women, if we do eliminate the glass ceiling, what percentage representation should we be aiming for in the boardroom? I'll let anyone answer that question. Caroline?
I'll answer it. 50-50, I think.
Yeah, there you go. Caroline, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just briefly, I think there's a lot of research that gives conflicting information. I think it's critical mass that's important rather than an absolute number, because we said women do make different choices. It could be that women don't naturally aspire to have 50-50 representation in the board with men, but it needs to be enough to influence and give power and diversity and that inclusiveness to the organisation. And generally that is somewhere between 30 and 40% is what the research has shown.
Okay, well, everyone else's questions, we will answer them offline, but if our speakers don't have any other comments, thank you to everyone for attending today, and a special thank you to our speakers. We're really grateful for your time and effort. I'd also especially like to thank Brian Kidd and Matthew Whelan and their respective colleagues at Nationwide who've actually made this session happen today. And at the London Institute of Banking and Finance, we care deeply about supporting young women in banking and financial services through our various different degree programs, through our Reach events, and also our Women in Finance scholarships go a long way in helping develop female talent. If you want to find out more about our degree programs, please do go onto our website. You might be a parent or a guardian who knows a young person who'd like a career in our industry. So I've given sort of an overview of what we do and how we support female talent. Finally, thank you so much to the speakers, and thank you for everyone attending today. Have a lovely afternoon. It's been really insightful. Take care, everyone. Goodbye.